History as it happens, January 20th, 2022. Weimar America.
New documents show a group from Michigan attempted to overturn the 2020 election by sending false documents.
And among them are high-profile Republicans, including the co-chair of the party, a high-level party official.
22 states have already enacted 47 new laws that make it more difficult to vote by mail, that make it harder to stay on voting lists.
That's why we're here today, to stand against the forces in America that value power over principle.
The president shouting that 52 senators and millions of Americans are racist.
He charged that voting against his bill allies us with Bull Connor, George Wallace, and Jefferson Davis. So much for unifying the country and working across the aisle.
Why do historians believe American democracy is on the verge of cracking up, with some comparing our crisis to the fall of the Weimar Republic, the collapse of Germany's unstable democracy leading to the rise of Adolf Hitler? Let's avoid cheap comparisons and zero in on the parallels between then and now that actually explain why democracy as we know it is in peril. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
With all the evidence we have, the Arizona election should be decertified by the legislature.
Come to think of it, there's a few other people I'd like to send right down to the prison down here in Florence. Anybody who was involved in that corrupt, shady, shoddy election of 2020.
Those that are responsible for the 2020 presidential election scam. It was a scam.
But I do think we can talk about fascist style and some of the ways in which Hitler sold National Socialism are being used to sell Trumpism.
Dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig...
In the first 6 months of 1933, Adolf Hitler, who was appointed chancellor in January by President Paul von Hindenburg, drove the final nails into the coffin of the Weimar Republic. Germany became a one-party police state under dictatorial rule. Civil liberties were abolished. Same for free elections. Internal enemies, socialists, communists, and other undesirables in the Nazi worldview were thrown into concentration camps. But the beginning of the end predated Hitler's rise by years. For the Weimar Republic from its inception was an experiment in democracy without enough Democrats, lowercase d. In the 1920s, Nazis and other right-wing fanatics clashed with communists in the streets. As conservative nationalists and militarists sought to use the system, the levers of power, to destroy it, to dismantle the parliamentary system they despised in what you might call a legal revolution. Does that sound like the America of 2022? Does Donald Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election while stoking violent resentments toward the system have any parallel in the Germany of our nightmares?
Parallels between the German crisis of democracy and the fate of Weimar has some extraordinarily eerie similarities and trajectory with the situation we find ourselves in. I think where the error is made is people then jump to an easy equation of Trump to Hitler, of Republicans to Nazis.
Historian Christopher Browning, an expert on Nazi Germany, is our guest, and our conversation is coming up in a bit. We are going to avoid cheap comparisons. There are no Adolf Hitlers or Nazis in mainstream American politics, although most recent presidents have been called Hitler by their more unhinged critics. So what about the Weimar Republic? It faced a crisis of legitimacy, not only because of events such as the 1920s hyperinflation, and not simply because it was born during a time of great national humiliation, Germany's defeat in the First World War. Weimar's legitimacy was under constant attack, rhetorical and otherwise, from Germans on the far left and right who wanted to end it. Polarization deepened, the sane middle became razor thin, and people such as Hitler spoke of their fellow Germans not as well-intentioned political opponents, but as enemies of the German nation and race, parasites sapping national strength, and the way out was to prevent such people from ever holding power again. Now, about us. Have you heard of Kari Lake, a former TV journalist? She is running for Arizona governor, and she spoke at Donald Trump's big outdoor rally the other day.
Come to think of it, there's a few other people I'd like to send right down to the prison down here in Florence. Anybody who was involved in that corrupt, shady, shoddy election of 2020. Lock them up.
The week before, President Joseph Biden invoked the legacies of Jefferson Davis and George Wallace to chide Republicans who don't support his party's voting rights bill. And while not as bonkers as Trump's big lie, Biden's remarks did not win over any Republicans who, as one might have expected, did not appreciate the comparison to some of the ugliest racists in American political history.
We have a sitting president of the United States shouting that United States senators are on the side of Bull Connor and Jefferson Davis for refusing to shatter the Senate.
Aside from all this rhetoric, there was another big story that somehow got a bit overshadowed by everything else going on. Here is the headline. In the weeks after the 2020 election, then President Donald Trump's allies sent fake certificates to the National Archives declaring that Trump won 7 states he actually lost. The documents had no impact on the outcome of the election, but they're yet another example of how Team Trump tried to subvert the Electoral College, a key line of inquiry for the January 6th committee. The fake certificates were created by Trump allies in Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, and New Mexico. Now, whatever you want to call that, that behavior is not consistent with a commitment to democracy. And it's one more example why serious historians believe there are useful comparisons to Weimar Germany, and why they believe American democracy is on the verge of cracking up. Christopher Browning is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. 3 times his work has won the National Jewish Book Award, most recently for Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp. And in 2018, for the New York Review of Books, he wrote an essay titled The Suffocation of Democracy. I recommend you read it. Christopher Browning, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
So are we crazy to talk about the Weimar Republic and American democracy 2022? Am I taking this too far? Am I an alarmist? Is American democracy really in this much trouble that we're reaching back to the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Third Reich?
Not if we make certain distinctions. That is, I think as long as we're focusing on the crisis of democracy, parallels between the German crisis of democracy and the fate of Weimar has some extraordinarily eerie similarities and trajectory with the situation we find ourselves in. I think where the error is made is people then jump to an easy equation of Trump to Hitler, of Republicans to Nazis, and those are separable issues. That is why Weimar fell, and then fragility of German democracy is one thing. Why Hitler was the successor and what the nature of the Hitler dictatorship is really a separable issue. And there, I think we have to be very careful. There, it is very unproductive to be simplistically equating Trump and Hitler or the current Trumpists with Nazis. They are very different in very significant ways. So there's some similarities, which we can talk about, but different enough that one has to keep those differences in mind, or you're not going to be dealing with reality. But I think you can gain great insight into the problems we face in the U.S. today if we look at the trajectory of crisis of the Weimar Republic.
I agree. And there's another issue here I'd like for you to address, although you've already covered it somewhat. The general ignorance about basic political and philosophical concepts complicates this debate. People throw around words like fascist or Nazi or communist or socialist to really just attack their political opponents. And these words can lose all of their meaning. So that's another reason why I guess I'm hesitant to dive into this debate.
Certainly, fascist has become rightfully so, a stigmatizing term, but that also means that it gets misused and flung rather indiscriminately, and it's not helpful to be indiscriminate. If you're really worried about fascism, then it's best not to fire away the ammunition on targets that aren't fascist. One has to be very cautious there. But at the same time, one doesn't want to ignore real dangers. I mean, I think we do face dangers, but we have to be realistic about how they are not identical to the dangers presented by a Mussolini or Hitler in the 20s and 30s.
I do not call Donald Trump a fascist. How do you define Trumpism? Do you consider Donald Trump a fascist?
I wouldn't use the term. I would answer that with a yes and a no. That is, in terms of the essence of fascism, which was fundamentally and openly anti-democratic and ended elections as soon as they came in, which was openly trying to construct a dictatorship and openly spoke about creating a totalitarian or a total state, and which was openly militaristic and openly seeking war and expansion, and in the end became genocidal. Trumpism is not a totalitarian movement. It is not a movement for war, and is not a movement for genocide. So the historical essence of Hitler is not going to be useful in understanding what Trump is. But I do think we can talk about fascist style and some of the ways in which Hitler sold National Socialism are being used to sell Trumpism and to mobilize people. So that I think we can make a distinction between, in a sense, the historical essence of fascism and what it meant in history, and elements of fascist style, which one can see that was part of Hitler's rise to power and success, that one finds similarly in Trump campaigns and in current American politics.
There were some specific historical contexts at work as well for Hitler's rise, and of course he was not alone in wanting to reverse or avenge the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. The far-right German nationalists were on his side on that. National expansion, turning on internal enemies, an obsession with race and Jews and socialists. Of course, those two terms overlapped quite a bit in that worldview. We're not in that world here in 2022.
Not in the same way, but Hitler talked about the November criminals who are blamed in the big lie for Germany's loss in World War I.
The stab in the back.
Yes, and that becomes the shared claim of virtually the entire German right. Not just Hitler, he's simply one of many Germans that bought into that, and that's very widely held on the German right. In a sense, becomes an entry ticket. I mean, where you are on the German political spectrum, one very clear sort of litmus test is, do you buy into the big lie or not? And overwhelmingly, the German right did. And it was impervious to fact. It was impervious to historical investigation. There was a Reichstag investigation. There were lots of history books written, but it was such a convenient myth and had such mobilizing power that it basically was impervious to being corrected by journalists, historians, the uncovering of a documentary record, and so on. That, I think, was a stark similarity that we see now. There is a kind of mobilization around a very powerful myth that has become broadly accepted on the right wing of both the Weimar political spectrum and the American political spectrum. Then again, of course, we have the issue of the beer hall putsch and the storming of the Capitol.
We're going to get to that,
two kind of attempted. The Americans don't have a word for coup d'etat or putsch because it hasn't been part of Anglo-American political history. So we have to borrow a foreign term from countries where they have a term for it because they've experienced it before. We don't know quite what to call it, the riot, insurrection, coup. But in fact, of course, it was a physical assault upon the Capitol with the attempt to overturn the result of the election and keep Trump in power. Hitler's was slightly different. It was to try to prevent the new Stresemann government in Germany from recovering from the deep crisis Germany was in over hyperinflation and the French occupation of the Ruhr, and to set in motion dominoes that would lead to the collapse of the Weimar Republic. That is, you took over Munich and Bavaria, you could march on Berlin, and the whole very fragile Weimar, deep in crisis in 23, they thought would fall apart in the way that Italy did when Mussolini marched on Rome in 1922, just a year earlier.
And neither had a chance at success, but we must judge them also by what was their intention. I often think if we had seen something like January 6th happen in another country, where a group of people, however misguided they were, attempted to stop the new government from taking power after it won an election fair and square, what would we call that? Especially if it was part of a larger effort to undermine public confidence in the election. We would probably call it a coup.
It was an attempted constitutional coup, in a sense, to set aside the constitutional ways of legitimizing a transfer of power in order to have Trump declare an emergency, remain in power, and just see the whole process come to a halt. In that sense, I think the beer hall putsch was also an attempt to get a fragile government to crumble and basically be chased out of power by a multiplying attack from below, starting in Munich and marching on Berlin.
I'm going to return to the beer hall push in a little bit and why Hitler was able to survive that politically and launch a comeback. But I want to stick with definitions just for a little bit longer. And a word you used just now, legitimacy. I think that's a key parallel. The constant rhetorical and other kinds of attacks on the legitimacy of the system. And that has a corrosive effect. And I want to ask you about the definition of authoritarianism, but let's take on this issue of delegitimizing the system, and then we'll get to authoritarianism next.
Yeah, well, certainly democracies are very dependent upon a consensus of legitimacy. Democracies require a consensus of what are the ground rules, that you compete within the ground rules, but you don't go beyond those. You can contest the game on the playing field, but you have to agree you're all playing by the same rules of the game. Those attacks basically break that consensus and say, no, we will go beyond the ground rules. We will attack the very notion of a transfer of power based upon the results of an election, overturn them, utterly corrosive of the consensus that helps hold democracies together. And of course, there's another similarity. Weimar's real problem was there was no democratic consensus. Now, in the United States, we've enjoyed 220 years of consensus, except during the period, of course, leading up to the Civil War, where you had one region that simply wouldn't accept a democratic verdict, a region with, in terms of overall population and economic productivity of the country, was continually getting smaller and smaller. Interesting, those recent research into who came to Washington for the riot, it was those counties where the balance demographically of white majorities was receding. And so in each of these, there was a sense that our world that we used to control, we're losing control of. If we don't do something now, we lose.
Resentments.
Resentments and fear. Certainly, again, in terms of fascist style, the cultivating of resentment and fear, we are the victims, is part of fascist rhetoric. Yeah, and I think one can see that as very central, of course, in Trump's appeal as well, a central part of Trump rhetoric.
Mass politics is fueled by resentments, as well as skill in using mass media. Authoritarianism, that's a word we hear quite a bit too. I think that's a safer way to go to describe what we might be experiencing here. It covers wannabe despots of any political persuasion, but it also might not be precise enough. I mean, for all of Donald Trump's faults, trying to overturn an election, inciting a mob or egging on a mob to attack the Capitol, he didn't call for banning the Democratic Party. He insulted reporters, but his administration didn't try to jail journalists or shut down newspapers.
My feeling is authoritarianism is too broad a term because that covers all sorts of different practices of government. Traditional authoritarian regimes basically wanted a passive population. More modern authoritarian regimes sought to mobilize people. I would prefer to use the term illiberal populism, because on the one hand, you are trying to preserve the veneer of democracy. You're not banning elections, but you want the legitimacy that election confers, but you don't want the accountability and peaceful transfer of power that real democratic elections entail. And this, I think, we can see from Putin to Orban to Trump to elsewhere. They have no problem wanting to legitimize themselves through holding elections. They just want to make sure those elections have only one outcome, and that they want to play on a utterly tilted playing field so that the outcome of the election is predictable and sure. And at the same time, they can claim they have the popular will of the people behind them.
I like that. Illiberal populism. I think I'm going to stop using authoritarianism and go with that one. It's better than illiberal democracy, which is an oxymoron. To Weimar, let's start by talking, and you alluded to this earlier, about the set of circumstances in which the Weimar Republic found itself and how it was able to unravel so quickly. Its leaders had to navigate an incredibly difficult time, the 1920s, the hyperinflation, the Great Depression. It had only a few years of relative stability before it all came apart. And on top of that, Germany did not have a rich tradition of democratic government.
Yeah, certainly one of my professors at the University of Wisconsin, when I was a graduate student, George Mossa, used to try to explain why the U.S. didn't have the European experience in the collapse of democracies in the 20s and 30s by saying, well, historically, America had democratic antibodies. The long tradition of a democracy that stretched over several centuries had made our system inoculated against, or at least prepared to fight. It had a certain immunity towards fascist infection. The sad thing now is we can't say that anymore. What we've seen now is that what we presumed were effective democratic antibodies immune to attack upon democracy, a long shared set of democratic norms, have been shattered. Trump has been maybe the spear point of that, but we should keep in mind that the erosion of some of those norms began before Trump, and that Trump has been, in a sense, both the agent, but also the beneficiary, both the accelerator as well as the kind of parasite upon developments that in some ways were already underway. If one is going back to what was sort of the real turning points, I would say it was the Supreme Court decision of Shelby that undermined the voting rights bill, the first part of that, and the 2010 elections in which there was a massive sweep in some of the states where gerrymandering was introduced in a way that it could never be undone. So you had a man in the Wisconsin legislature where they have gerrymandered in a supermajority. I mean, the only thing that matters in Wisconsin state legislative elections now is, do you have a majority or do you have a supermajority? There's no conceivable way Democrats can retake the Wisconsin legislature under its current gerrymandering. The same thing as in North Carolina. Then in those states, you then engage in the next step, which is voter suppression. And now the third step will be taking over the electoral machinery, not only to make obstacles in the way of people who can vote, and to dilute the power that their vote has, so that votes for some people are more difficult than others, and the vote someone casts is weighted differently than someone else. But now, whose vote even gets counted?
Legal revolution.
So, this started before Trump came in. For me, this is, in a sense, the great threat that we face right now. Not people storming the Capitol, but a legal revolution in which the Supreme Court undermining both Article 5 of the Voting Rights Act and then now Article 2, where Alito says it's not illegal to make voting inconvenient for people. No. You don't have to have equal access to the polls. And so if you, in fact, both dilute people's votes and make access to the polls unequal, and you concede such sovereignty to state legislatures that they're free, in effect, to run elections in which they can now have partisan legislatures deciding the outcome. In Arizona, the legislature subpoenaed the ballots and voting machines, took them away, locked them in a warehouse, and turned them over to a partisan hired group to count. In Georgia, the legislature is empowered to dismiss the electoral boards of 4 counties. Atlanta happens conveniently to have 4 counties, and appoint their own person to be in charge of the electoral count. This is just, to my mind, just utterly dangerous. I mean, we're basically saying that the counting of the vote now is going to be a partisan spoil. And anybody who didn't go along, this thin veneer of Republican electoral officials, Raffensperger in Georgia, the state secretary in Arizona, they're being purged or they're being set aside. In Arizona now, it's the attorney general, not the state secretary, that'll run the election. They're running against Raffensperger in Georgia.
Norms are more important than laws in many ways, is what I think you're saying here.
Democracies depend on norms. You cannot pass laws that foresee every contingency. You have to depend on certain consensually held norms.
I often wonder, what if Raffensperger had gone along with Donald Trump's request to find X number of votes in that infamous phone call? What if people in the Justice Department heeded Trump and said, yes, the 2020 election was fraudulent. There were problems there. I suppose ultimately it winds up before the Supreme Court in seeking a parallel to Weimar here. The institutions, the norms, the guide rails completely collapsed in a short amount of time.
Here, I think, again, there's sort of similarities and differences. That is, the lesson Hitler drew from the failed beer hall putsch was that in a modern state, you don't come to power by storming the Bastille, by storming the Capitol. You come to power through a legal revolution. To my mind, that is one of the scariest similarities we now face. That Hitler got appointed chancellor legally, according to the Constitution, by Hindenburg. He persuaded Hindenburg to use the emergency powers vested in the president of the Weimar Republic to destroy the democracy. Minor things. We have to suspend free speech, free press, and freedom of assembly. We have to suspend due process.
And the Weimar Republic had been ruled before Hitler through emergency decree for several years.
Yes, that is, even in the 20s, emergency powers had been invoked to save it from attacks from the right and the left. It was beleaguered from both the communists on the left and anti-democratic right-wing elements. And at least initially, the emergency powers were being used for the purpose for which the constitutional designers had created them, to defend the republic from emergency outside attacks. What happened in 1930 is that Hindenburg uses it as a substitute for keeping a democratically run country going democratically. That is, he appoints a chancellor who doesn't need a majority in the Reichstag, and he rules by decree. So Germany is ruled by decree, not by somebody who uses them to be utterly dictatorial or whatever, but they are ruled without majority rule from 30 to 33. And then it's another jump when you, in fact, use the emergency powers to utterly gut the democracy. And that's what happens with such extraordinary rapidity from January to July of 1933, when Hitler basically, having come to power, undoes the democracy from within and creates a total dictatorship.
Because there were also enough people willing to go along, because they were utterly frustrated with the state of things prior to that. Parliamentary democracy had been delegitimized in their view, and not without reason.
Well, by the summer of 1932, if you combine the Nazi and Communist Party votes, it's over 50%. More than half of Germany was voting either for Joe Stalin or Adolf Hitler. Democracy does not work when over half your population is voting for Joe Stalin or Adolf Hitler.
Well, it's been said that the Weimar Republic was an experiment in democracy without Democrats. So.
Without enough Democrats.
Enough. And it started really under Bruning's chancellorship.
That's the point at which conservatives give up on trying to run the country through the inconvenience of democratic parliamentary government and resort to turning emergency powers into the everyday way by which things are done. Democracy became utterly dysfunctional, and then it gets replaced. It became utterly gridlocked and paralyzed. Then it becomes replaceable. So it's a crucial stage in not only delegitimizing democracy, but delegitimizing it by making it utterly gridlocked and dysfunctional. So people in the end say, what else can we do? The real difficulty here is, of course, once Hitler begins to use the emergency powers of the president to dismantle democracy, if you want to defend democracy, you have to take the illegal acts to try to stop it. How do you defend democracy? By undemocratic, illegal means. Democracy is the rule of law. But to defend democracy, you're going to have to break the law. And that's the dilemma we're going to face in 2024, when various states overturn the majority election in their states and switch their delegations to Trump. And the Supreme Court will say state legislatures are sovereign in deciding the electoral process in each state. And you will have a legal revolution. And those of us that are appalled by this will have no legal recourse.
To my earlier point, the what if. What if next time a state government, as you just explained, decides they're going to reject the electoral vote count simply because they don't like it?
It's almost sure to happen. These laws are being passed now so they can be used. They aren't passing these laws to leave them in the cupboard. If you're passing these laws, it's because you intend to use them.
Wouldn't be able to do it under a landslide situation, but in a close election.
And now we're guaranteed for close elections. We're so polarized along such lines with so few swing voters that any president election now is always going to hang by 5 or 6 or 7 states.
As we talk here, and by the way, thank you for nimbly jumping around. I'm not really sticking to the chronology. We're bouncing from subject to subject. Here's a parallel I think that works. Just as the conservative nationalists in the German government welcomed in Hitler, right? They thought they could co-opt him and control him. The modern-day Republican Party has been criticized for not dumping Donald Trump when they had a chance. Instead, they embraced him, and now he is the Republican Party. Depending on who you ask, some people believe his influence is waning. I tend to think he still is in charge of the party. That's the criticism. What do you think of that?
This is where I think, again, you have a kind of eerie parallel between what I would call the traditional conservatives and the new conservatives or the radical conservatives. Traditional Republicans, of course, have been, we're favoring big business. We want deregulation. We want lower taxes, but we want free trade. We certainly aren't appealing to the working class. And they weren't going to get a majority vote along those lines. In one of the last 6 presidential elections, the Republicans won the popular vote. They've twice won the presidency without the popular vote, and my fear is that's going to become absolutely the standard in the future. For traditional conservatives, if they're going to be competitive, they have to find somebody that can appeal to groups they haven't appealed to and can appeal to. So for the German national conservatives, Hitler was going to be, quote, the drummer boy. He was going to be the person that whipped up those people in society that traditional conservatives could not appeal to. They hire him basically to campaign against the Young Plan and the Young Plan referendum in 1928, give him total support of the conservative media, turn him into a national figure. This is before the big breakthrough in 1930. In 1932, when the Brüning government, whatever its faults, had tried to outlaw the SA and try to end violence in the streets, Hindenburg's advisor, General Schleicher, basically said if the Nazis did not exist, we would have to invent them. We have no hope of transforming the Weimar Republic into an authoritarian government without popular support from somewhere, and Hitler and the Nazis are the only source we have.
Well, they feared communism and socialism a lot more than they did the right-wing fringe.
Yes, there's a demonization and a paranoia about what the Social Democrats would amount to if they came in. One can see the same demonization of Hillary Clinton, I think. In France, during the Popular Front election in 1936, French conservatives, who used to be the great patriotic nationalists, were saying better Hitler than Blum. Blum was a socialist and a Jew. What could be more terrifying to them than the prospect that a Jewish social democrat might be the next prime minister of France? In fact, learning from what happened in Germany, the center and the left stuck together and won the 1936 election in France, and France did not go fascist. But the way in which conservative Germans spoke about socialists, these are moderate social democrats. These are people who you would say would be left center, as if they were the coming Bolshevik revolution. And listen to some of the Republican rhetoric about, quote, the progressive Democrats. So there is this paranoia about the opposition coming in that justifies allying with anybody on the right, no matter how unsavory, no matter how dangerous to democracy they might be.
That's a great point, because just as the far right in Germany demonized center leftists, so did Stalin at that time, did not allow the communists in Germany to cooperate with the Social Democrats. They were right deviationists. In his eyes, they were too conservative. So that prevented the left from working together.
Yeah, Hitler at the peak got 37% of the electorate in the summer of 33. He had dropped to 33% in the fall. The Nazis were in decline.
And he thought that he had missed the time.
For the conservatives, in a sense, the best bargaining chip Hitler had was threatening to collapse because they needed him so badly they would rescue him if the Nazis were on the brink of bankruptcy and political dissolution. It was, in fact, the decline of Hitler in the fall that gave him his strongest bargaining chip with von Papen and Hindenburg. As I think it was von Papen, when the British ambassador said, you can defeat the Nazis, just run new elections until they go bankrupt. Von Papen, through the British ambassador, said, but if we destroy the Nazis, who will save us from the communists?
Hitler was a lot of things. Unfortunately, lucky was one of them. Let's return to Hitler and the beer hall push now, if you don't mind, and why his career wasn't kaput after that. I mean, after all, he tried to violently overthrow the Bavarian government. I think part of the problem was, and maybe this is another parallel to today, it's just too hard to believe or take this person seriously. This rabble-rouser. I mean, this can't happen. We're not going to collapse under this guy. I mean, who in their right mind in 1925, for instance, would ever have expected Adolf Hitler to be Chancellor of Germany?
Yeah, certainly after the beer hall putsch, Hitler is brought to trial. He uses the trial to kind of invert the framing of what had happened. The people who should be on trial, he says, are the November criminals, not him. It's like Trump saying the insurrection was November 3rd, not January 6th. And so you invert what had been the insurrection into the patriotic act and what had been the practice of democracy into the crime against the country. That's sold again with the right. He's given a modest sentence. In fact, while he was in jail for 13 months, I think he had over 350 visitors. He held salon, gained weight because so many people brought in all their goodies to basically entertain him. This was not an onerous imprisonment by any means. And two things happened. One, they didn't use the law they could have to expel him as a convicted felon because he's an Austrian citizen. He could have been sent out of the country, end of Hitler, period. They also had a speaker's ban on him when he got out, and then they lifted that so he could go back into politics. His career could have been snuffed very easy. Just as the Republicans, if they wanted to end Trump's career in January, could have impeached him and then voted that he would never be eligible for elected office again. They not only wouldn't impeach him, they certainly wouldn't go beyond that to ban him from further election. So both of these men were terribly underestimated. Both of them could have had their careers ended through legal means. And in each case, the conservative allies have decided they're too indispensable.
Violence, political violence, breaking the taboo on political violence. Even though Hitler performed what might be called a legal revolution, there was always an element of extra legality to what the Nazis were doing. There was violence in the streets of the Weimar Republic, one reason why many middle-class Germans wanted law and order, an end to, well, the mayhem in the streets and the clashes between the right and the left. January 6th has left a disturbing legacy in that it doesn't seem to have bothered enough people enough. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, here again, January 6th or beer hall were attack upon the center of government. What Hitler then learned is you needed to keep violence more local. So yes, you were having the legal revolution. You turned the Nazi party from a street fighting party into an electoral vehicle, but you still kept the street fighters, and the violence is local. Take over this tavern, take over this block, break up these socialist rallies, and so forth. We see the same pattern now. The Proud Boys are going into local areas to town hall meetings, to school board meetings. It's a very intimidating presence. I mean, you can see some of the clips of these, and they do realize even the threat of violence or even the intimidating presence at the local level is very effective.
The left was in disarray during the Weimar Republic, especially the later years. Do you believe the American left is in disarray today? And generally speaking, what do you see as the problems there?
Well, in the sense, again, we have a kind of similarity in the sense that with so much opposition to the Weimar Republic on both the right and the communists on the left, simply to put together a governing coalition with majority in the Reichstag required a coalition that spanned from the party of the German industrialists, the German People's Party, through the Social Democrats. And the same thing now, of course, with the Republicans in Congress basically saying no to anything. To have any kind of governance, you have to go from Alicia Cortez all the way to Joe Manchin.
AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah, Cortez, yeah. This is such a fragile coalition because it has to stretch so far. But it has to do that because there's so many people who won't be on the playing field of trying to engage in parliamentary or legislative governance. And so those fall apart very quickly, and then you get gridlock. Then you get paralysis, and of course, then the right runs against gridlock.
So going back to my initial point about the importance of studying this era without making cheap comparisons and whether we're just going too far bringing up the Weimar Republic and Adolf Hitler, so many historians and informed people who have spent their lives studying this type of thing really believe we're in trouble right now.
I believe we're in trouble. I think we're hanging by a thread. And I have tremendous fear for the 2024 election. I guess I'm assuming that the Republicans will take over the House in 2022 without needing to invoke their final option of, in a sense, the state legislatures are passing laws that will allow them to cast electoral votes. So that won't affect what I think are the 2022, where the focus will be on the loss of the House to the Republicans, which I presume will happen.
Which often does happen in a midterm election, the party in the White House.
I mean, that is so standard even in normal times, and we're in anything but normal times. The real key, of course, will be the Senate. Those are statewide Senate elections where the gerrymandering doesn't count, and it's a favorable map to the Democrats. The past few have not been, but I think the Republicans are presumably vulnerable in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin. There may be a competitive race in North Carolina. I doubt the Democrats can hold on to Warnock's seat in Georgia, but it is a possibility the Democrats will either gain a seat or hold a tie, which would be crucial for, of course, simply appointing judges. And if there's a Supreme Court vacancy, of course, we now know the new McConnell rule is if the Senate and the president are different parties, there are no judges appointed. Judges are a spoil system now. So and that's a norm that the McConnell shattered. We'll live with it. I don't think you can put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
It's also not encouraging to have to rely on the Democratic Party to save us. David Brooks, the moderately conservative columnist for the New York Times, wrote a column recently about this and how the Democrats are aiming their efforts in the wrong direction.
I think David Brooks a little unfair there in the sense that the Democrats are in effect, a kind of lose-lose situation. That is, if they move on the only things they can do without a supermajority, it means you can only pass bills by reconciliation, which means it can only be the financial issues. They didn't go to voting rights early because that requires a 60 vote. They don't have anything remotely close. There's no way they're going to come anywhere close. The margins are so razor thin that they just have no room to work. But only half of Congress will take their legislative responsibility seriously, and the other half is devoted to obstruction. Things don't get done. In that sense, Biden got two things done. He got the COVID relief bill passed, and he got the other one passed. The Democratic problem is instead of broadcasting their victories, they magnify their differences and their frustrations and let Republican obstruction go unnoticed because of the difficulties of disunity in the Democratic Party being highlighted.
Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson had huge majorities to work with. A final question. Is it difficult spending your entire academic career in this dark world, writing about the Holocaust, the Third Reich, really the most miserable chapter in human history?
It's easier to write about something that's on the outside in somebody else's history. Yes, it's certainly difficult to write about what happened in Nazi Germany and the Holocaust in the 30s and 40s, but I can look at that with a certain kind of detachment. As a historian, you always have to kind of both try to put yourself back into the period to see it the way people experienced and understood it, and the critical distance of looking back, knowing what happened and knowing the documents that we've been able to see now. Emotionally, it's harder now to be in the middle of this. And I look at it and says, I know what's going to happen. Why can't people see it? Isn't this obvious what's going to happen? Why are we quibbling over this and that when democracy is at stake? And how can half our population just not care and be supporting a party that has become openly anti-democratic? That's the real frustration to me. It's like the Germans, we've got a country now with not enough Democrats, with a small d.
Christopher Browning, we thank you for guiding us through a dark conversation. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the U.S. once built big things. The Erie Canal, the interstate highway system, hundreds of airports. So why have our infrastructure dreams shrank? Especially when considering China's massive effort to surpass the United States. That's next when we report History as It Happens, some transportation history, a podcast from the Washington Times.